Welcome back. Today we'll be discussing Chapter 37, which covers hazardous materials, multiple casualty incidents, and incident management. This is one of those chapters where it's a little boring, and it covers a lot of very rare situations you might run into, but it is one of those things that if you run into these situations, you have to know how to act. So it is very important, even though it's something that you might only see a handful of times in a 30-year career. So with that being said, let's jump into it. The two topics that we're going to be covering today are hazardous materials and multiple casualty incidents and how to handle those at the incident command level. Starting with hazardous materials. So a quick definition of what a hazardous material is. It's any substance or material in a form which poses an unreasonable risk to health, safety, and property when transported in commerce. So there's 4 different levels of hazmat training. The one that you're going to be trained to is first responder awareness. There is no mandated minimum for first responder awareness, so there's no real standard across the board. Usually, after you join an agency, they're going to require more first responder awareness training on hazmat. So that's why this chapter is a little light on the hazmat side, because they're expecting your agencies to be compliant with OSHA to cover hazmat training themselves. The next level is first responder operations. That's most firefighters in New York State go through first responder operations, especially interior firefighters. That's about 8 hours of teaching. You deal with how to dam, dike, and divert hazardous materials there. Then you have hazardous materials technician. That's an additional 24 hours. That's how to actually operate within the hot zone. And then you have hazardous materials specialist, which is 24 additional hours, and that's how to deal with the hazardous material itself. So your job as an EMT, it's essentially to recognize it's a hazardous incident and then get away from it. So that's really what we want to drill into you guys, is just know how to recognize it and stay away from it. So recognizing that incidents can involve trucks, they can involve ships, they can involve trains, anything that chemicals are either used or transported in can be an area of hazardous material. So if you go into a warehouse or some sort of commercial building, there could be a hazardous material there. All patients leaving the site where the hazardous material is should be considered contaminated until proven otherwise. So there's 3 different zones of a hazardous material incident. You have the hot zone, the warm zone, and the cold zone. So the hot zone is where the hazardous material is. That is where you are in actual danger from the hazardous material. The warm zone is the area immediately next to the hot zone. That's shouldn't have any exposure to the hazardous material, but people are coming out and they're exposed. So this is where decontamination happens, is in the warm zone. So there is still some issues in the warm zone. You don't want to be in there because the people coming out are contaminated. So it's not safe until they're decontaminated and they come out into the cold zone. The cold zone is the area immediately adjacent to the warm zone, and that's where you should be. That's where all the equipment and emergency rescuers are staged, including you, because you are not, as an EMT, you're not supposed to be operating the hazardous material incident. You just need to recognize that it is one. The safe zone should always be uphill and upwind from the incident. That way there's no chance that something is coming towards you, whether it's running downhill or being blown at you. If you can, try to identify the substance. That's why a lot of ambulances have binoculars in them, so that you can look from a ways away and find out what substance it is, and we'll discuss how to identify that. So some things you can look for are the hazardous material placards or labels. The placards are usually well displayed, and they'll give you a general idea of what category of hazardous material this is, and some might have a specific number that you can look up in a book, which we'll talk about in a minute, to find out what specific chemical it is. You can also check for invoices, bills of lading, and shipping manifests if you are actually inside, but hopefully you've identified this as a hazardous material incident before you are inside and that close, unless if someone brings that stuff to you from the hot zone. So reviewing the safety data sheets, that is the actual sheet that says this is what the material is, this is what to do for it. That's very helpful if you have that available. And you can also talk to workers or others leaving the hot zone, because chances is that they know that chemical very well and they know how to deal with it. Like I said in the previous slide, the Emergency Response Guidebook is a very thick book that's mandated to have in every ambulance in New York State, and that one is where you can look to see the code on the placard and identify inside of the ERG and find out what it is and what to do about it. This is a picture of the 2012 version of the ERG. Like I said, it's relatively thick and it should be on every emergency vehicle in the state. So establishing a treatment area. We are always operating in the cold zone. I know I said that before, I'm going to say it again. We work in the cold zone. It should be protected from the weather, so a tent can be put up. Usually hazmat response teams have all the materials to set up a treatment area in the cold zone. It should be large enough to accommodate multiple rescue crews, easily accessible, away from vehicles so you don't have exhaust fumes, and allows for rapid re-entry into the emergency operation. That way people can come, deliver your patients, and then go back into the operation zone. When people are in the treatment area, they should have been decontaminated, but field decontaminated patients aren't always completely clean. They do the best that they can, but they could still have some sort of hazardous material on them. So keep that in mind, and because of that, you should be wearing full PPE to make sure that you don't get a secondary contamination. You should protect your vehicles from contamination. Use as much disposable equipment as possible. If you use something that gets contaminated, it's getting thrown out anyway. So just keep that in mind. If you have to use something, use it, but the chance of it needing to be thrown out after you use it is high. So try to use disposable equipment. Structural firefighting clothing is not designed or recommended for use when working with hazardous material environments. There are special hazmat suits that are worn. The normal gear that firefighters are given is not adequate. So keep that in mind. So there are 4 types of patients in a hazardous material incident. There is the uninjured and not contaminated. This is a completely normal patient. They do not need your treatment. There's the injured and not contaminated. These are just like every normal patient. There's the uninjured and contaminated. This is someone that it depends on the incident whether they need treatment or not. It depends on the material. And then there's the injured and contaminated. These are the ones that you're probably going to see the most of because they actually require treatment and they were exposed to the chemical. So just keep that in mind. Those are the 4 different types you'll see. The last one of injured and contaminated are obviously the most dangerous for us. The ERG is your lifeline to knowing what to do. So take all the precautions for whatever chemical it is, and that will be found in the ERG. First aid measures are also listed in the ERG, but when in doubt, go back to your basics. Manage the patient's critical needs and manage their ABCs. Follow your practical flow sheets. We teach them for a reason. When in doubt, you always revert back to that. If treatment calls for irrigation with water, know that water does not neutralize the substance. It only dilutes it, which is good, especially if we're trying to get it like off skin. Diluting it is good, but it doesn't neutralize it. So any runoff of that water is probably contaminated. So keep that in mind. You don't want to get the water that you're pouring on the patient on you. After treating the patient, you should decontaminate yourself, and that could mean that you need to throw away your uniform. This is one of the reasons why we always recommend when you go to work, always have a spare uniform in your car. You never know when you're going to be covered in blood or covered in some sort of hazardous material. So always keep a spare uniform within easily accessible areas of you. Moving on into multiple casualty incidents. So a mass casualty incident, or MCI, is defined as any event that the needs of resources exceeds immediately available resources. So what does that mean? It can either be small scale or large scale, and it really depends on where you're working. It's just if you need 5 ambulances and you don't have 5 ambulances, then it's an MCI because your needs exceeds what's immediately available. If you work in the middle of Oswego County where it's really rural and there's only one ambulance available in 20 miles, and you have 2 patients, you need 2 ambulances, that is technically an MCI because you don't have the resources to meet the need at that point. If you work in the city of Syracuse where there's 10 ambulances free sometimes, which is kind of rare nowadays, but there could theoretically be 10 ambulances available and you have 7 patients, you can have those 7 ambulances come pretty immediately. So that's not technically an MCI. So that's the strict definition, is anytime that your resources cannot be immediately met, it qualifies as MCI. So when you're operating within an MCI, know your local disaster plan. These are why we have departments of emergency management. They are there to make these types of plans. They should be well publicized, they should be realistic and rehearsed. They're at least once a year should be some sort of MCI drill in your immediate county area so that these are rehearsed and it's not a surprise to people, especially leadership, of how things should run. The incident command system, this is something that you should have gone through already. It is mandatory to go through incident command system training offered by FEMA before you get your EMT card, but we'll just do a quick review of it. So the National Incident Management System, or NIMS, consists of these following branches. You have command, operations, logistics, planning, finance, and single incident or unified incident response. So some command functions. Incident command is assumed by the most senior member of the first service on scene. This can change after more people arrive. Either you can continue being command or you can transfer command to someone of higher rank. So if you are, say, in a responding ambulance to the MCI and you're the most senior EMT on that ambulance, you are incident command when you first arrive. You are in charge. Now, you probably don't want to be in charge because you have very limited training and knowledge and that's not your specialty. But then say a fire chief arrives on scene, you can then transfer that command to that fire chief. Or say your director of the ambulance arrives on scene, you can transfer command to the director. That way you can get back to doing what you are specialized in, which is treating patients. There's 2 different modes of action. You have the scene size up and triage, and then you have organization and delegation. So it really depends on your role in the incident of what you're going to be doing. So scene size up. You arrive at the scene and you establish incident command. When you are the incident commander, you need to have a good overview of what's going on. So you need to do a quick walkthrough of the scene to assess the number of patients, hazards, and the degree of entrapment. This way you know what type of resources to call for. As a rule of thumb, it's better to call for more resources than are needed because it's easier to cancel someone than it is to start someone. So get a decent idea of what you need and then call for it and kind of overestimate what you might need. Be as calm and composed as possible and radio an initial scene report and call in for those additional resources. You do not want to sound panicked on the radio, and you don't want to be panicked. When you're panicked, you don't make sound decisions. Like we said, on arrival, give the brief report and request additional resources. The incident commander should be the only person to talk with the communications center and disseminate information to others. This keeps the radio frequencies clear for emergent traffic. Having everyone try to be on the radio talking to each other is a complete mess, and a lot of messages get lost in that system. So try to have face-to-face conversations with command staff whenever possible. Keep the radio traffic to a minimum. Whoever's in charge of organization, which is typically someone separate from incident command, their job is to plan out and deploy the resources. So command calls for the resources, organization sends out the resources. They're the ones who actually tell the resources what to do. They think about supply and staging areas. They hopefully prevent freelancing, which freelancing is people doing what they want to do without getting orders to do that. Yeah, this should be a very structured thing that comes from one person. That way there's no confusion, there's no stepping over other people. A lot of times People in charge of the organization will have a tactical worksheet or some sort of board where they can track what's going on. So incident command is in charge of the entire thing, but operations actually delegates what's going to happen inside. So things that you might be a part of as the EMS branch. You might be part of extrication of patients, the staging area, the triage area, the treatment area, the transportation area, or the rehab area. The biggest thing that we need to talk about is triage. Triage is just a very quick, rudimentary way of sorting people. The goal is to afford the greatest number of people the greatest chance of survival. Usually you should have the most knowledgeable EMS provider be the triage supervisor. You should have someone who is very experienced because they can quickly assess patients very, 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 very quickly and keep on moving on. It is a, like I said, very rudimentary system, but it's designed for you to spend 10 to 15 seconds with each patient and be able to sort them so that people behind you know what order to treat patients in. So we have 4 different priorities, and a patient may upgrade priorities as they deteriorate in condition. So just because they start out as a priority 4, or maybe, sorry, not priority 4, priority 3, they could become a priority 2 or a priority 1 later down the road. So the initial triage ticket is not the final triage ticket sometimes. So we'll talk about the 4 priorities. Priority 1 has a treatable life-threatening illness or injury, and we're going to actually show you the flow sheet to determine who's priority 1 through 4. Priority 2 should have a serious but not life-threatening illness or injury. Priority 3 are what we call the walking wounded, so someone who has some sort of injury but they are able to walk. And then priority 4 is someone who is dead or fatally injured. That means almost dead. So they are still alive and you can mark them as dead because they are beyond help, or they're going to be beyond most people's help. You know, if you're called to just one person who is that mortally injured, maybe you can save them, but it's going to take the resources of 8 to 9 people, which on an MCI you don't have the ability to afford those resources. So priority 4 is dead or fatally injured. START triage is the national standard for triage, and we're going to, like I said, go through the actual thing on, I believe, the next slide. So it's just a simple and rapid triage. It's based off of patient evaluation of RPM, which is respiration, pulse, and mental status. Those are the priorities that we go through with the START triage. Please note that that's not our typical way of assessing patients. Usually we assess pulse first, then respiration, then mental status, but we do respiration, pulse, mental status on START triage. All right, so this is what the START triage flowchart looks like. The first question, and again, this is a different system. So first question right here, are you able to walk? If you are able to say yes to that, you are immediately considered a priority 3, a minor patient. You're told to walk to secondary triage. So anyone, no, regardless of whatever injury or complaint they have, they're able to walk, yes, they are immediately priority 3. Okay? This is why we say that it can change. If they're walking to secondary triage and they collapse, then they are no longer this priority 3. So if they're not able to walk, you then go down. Remember, we talked about breathing as your first step. So are they spontaneously breathing? If you go to no, reposition their airway. Make sure that their airway is open. If they have no respirations, even if they have a pulse, you are marking them as expectant or dead, because to save them, it will require too many resources that you don't have at that moment in time. Again, this is designed to save as many lives as possible. If you can save 7 other people instead of focusing on this one person who might die anyway, then that's what we're going to do. So if you reposition the airway and they're still not breathing, they're dead. If you reposition their airway and they start to breathe, then they are marked as immediate, which is priority 1. Okay? So that is the respirations flowchart for not breathing. If they are breathing, measure their respiratory rate. If it is below 30, then they're considered to be adequately breathing. So you keep on going down. If they are above 30, then they are not adequately breathing. They're immediately marked priority 1. Okay? We then move down. And then we assess the pulse because we just did all the respirations, which is right here. So then we go down to pulse for the RPM. You look if their radial pulse is absent or if their capillary refill is below 2 seconds, or sorry, above 2 seconds, not below, then they are marked as immediate right there. If the radial pulse is present or the capillary refill is below 2 seconds, then you go down to their mental status, the last M in the RPM. If they can obey commands, then they're marked as delayed, which is priority 2. If they cannot obey commands, they're marked as immediate. So I know this is a lot of information. This is contained in the START triage kit. So don't worry about having to memorize this. You should know the general theme of it, and there will be test questions on how to immediately mark some people, but this is in the triage kit. So if you ever forget it, you should have this flowchart in the triage kit. So this is a example of a triage tag. This should go around the patient at some point, and it's again supposed to be very, very, very quick. And you can see your RPM is right here, and you can mark, yes, they were breathing. What was their perfusion, +2 or -2 seconds? Can they follow simple commands, yes or no? So this is meant to be very quick on the initial, and then whatever they are, you then rip off up to where they are. So if they are delayed, you then rip off the minor, so all you see is delayed. If they're immediate, you rip off both, so you just see immediate. If they're deceased, you rip off everything, and they stay as deceased. Again, if they get triaged another time and things have changed, you can keep on ripping up. You can always move up priorities. And then there's a little bit of stuff right here that will tell someone if you did treatment. This is more for secondary triage than the primary. Primary, again, is just marking which of these are they and then moving on. Let the people behind you start treatments and do more further investigation into the patient. There are only 2 treatments provided during START triage. You can open the airway to insert an OPA, insert an OPA, and you can apply pressure to arterial bleeding. Those are the only 2 things that you can do during the initial triage, because those are things that might be able to save their life in a couple seconds. If it's something beyond that, you move on, you let the people behind you treat for longer periods of time, because people behind you can walk and say, okay, this person's a priority 1, this person needs treatment now, this person's a priority 2, they can wait, this person's priority 3, they can wait. So your job is just to sort, their job behind you is to treat. Like we said, secondary triage is performed at a patient collection point. Usually that is outside. There's 3 huge tarps. One will be green, one will be yellow, one will be red. And patients are extricated out there and placed in the appropriate area based off of their priority. So each treatment area should have its own treatment supervisor. So there should be someone supervising the red, yellow, and green areas. And keep in mind, it may be necessary to recategorize a patient whose condition has deteriorated or improved, but usually it's going to be deteriorated because, again, you're not providing any intervention that would help them improve. Transportation and staging logistics. So after we have gotten the patients out, they've been triaged, they've been treated, they should be transported according to priority. You should have ambulances in a staging area waiting to be called in, and their job is to come in, take their patient, and leave. There should be a very quick interaction. That way the treatment area does not get clogged up with ambulances. You should have a staging supervisor and a transportation supervisor. A staging supervisor should say, this ambulance goes in now, this ambulance goes in now, and it should help coordinate the resources of incoming and outgoing ambulances. And then the transportation supervisor should decide your destination. So the transportation supervisor, when you pull in, should say, you're taking this patient to this hospital. We don't try to send them all to one hospital. Even if there's a lot of trauma patients, you can't send all the trauma patients to the trauma center because you're going to overwhelm that hospital. And it's better to have a patient go to a hospital that's not necessarily specialized in that area and get some treatment than to be sitting at the proper hospital and just waiting because they don't have the resources to take care of you. So the transportation supervisor should be coordinating with the hospitals for proper transportation or transport locations of patients, And it might be appropriate to request an emergency physician to the scene, and that emergency physician can provide care, but they can also make more advanced decisions on transport. They can say, yes, this hospital can take this, or this hospital can take that. During an MCI, you may have to transport more than one person in an ambulance. We really try to limit this, but sometimes resources call for that. If you have no other ambulances and you have 2 or 3 patients, all that are within your ability to treat, you might end up with 2 or 3 patients. You do have to be able to secure all patients properly and have enough equipment to treat them all. The reason why I said 2 or 3 patients, it should be at the BLS level. If you have 2 or 3 ALS patients, you usually only have 1 cardiac monitor. You don't have the equipment to handle more than 1 ALS patient at a time. So make sure that you have enough equipment to treat all the patients at the same time, which means multiple patients should be BLS patients. Do not put opposing parties in the same ambulance. This is more of a key for like MVAs. So if you hit someone's car, you shouldn't put the drivers of the 2 vehicles in the same ambulance. They tend to fight, so it's just not a good idea. A very large-scale MCI might have a bus for transport of the walking wounded. So the people who are very minorly injured, you might call on a bus and have an EMT get in that bus and just supervise all the patients on the way to the hospital. That is not an uncommon thing with very large-scale MCIs. The last time I saw this happen in the Syracuse area was when there was actually a bus accident on 81. They brought in another bus to load in most of the patients that weren't severely injured, which there were some very severely injured patients at that incident. We're going to do a little bit of triage practice now. So you respond to a reported explosion in an office building. You have 4 victims. Victim 1 is a 33-year-old female who walks to you, has a piece of metal embedded in her abdomen. Going back to that start triage, this is a perfect example. This is someone who is very injured, but she is walking to you. So per the start triage, she is automatically a green. She is a priority 3 because she is able to walk. Victim 2 is a 20-year-old male lying on the ground with a left femur fracture. So assuming that this victim has adequate breathing and has adequate pulse and that they can follow your commands, he is going to be a yellow or a priority 2 because he cannot walk, but he has all the RPM intact. Victim 3 is a 59-year-old male, not conscious, not breathing, bleeding from the head. So this person, if you try to reposition their airway and they are still not breathing, then he is dead. He is a priority 4 regardless. Victim 4 is a 14 female, not conscious, is breathing, and has an obvious head injury. So since she is not conscious, but she is breathing, she will be a priority 1. Victim 5 is a 45-year-old male who is conscious, breathing, has multiple burn marks, skin is pale and clammy, and has a weak carotid pulse. So this victim requires a little bit more information to triage. If they are conscious, following your commands, if they are breathing less than 30 times a minute, and if their capillary refill is below 2 seconds, this is going to be a priority 2. Although if they can walk, they're going to be a priority 3. So this one kind of requires a little bit more information to fully triage. Next one is an 18-year-old female who has multiple long bone fractures, respiratory rate of 40, is conscious and complaining of pain. So since they have multiple long bone fractures, we're probably assuming they cannot walk. And since the respiratory rate is above 30, because it's 40, they are going to be a priority 1. Last one is a 50-year-old male complaining of chest pain and shortness of breath, walking around looking for help. So even though typically chest pain and shortness of breath is a high priority patient for us, since he can walk around, he is considered a priority 3 right now. So you can see how triage, it's a rudimentary system. It's not perfect, but it's designed to save as many people as possible. Going into some chapter review. Use your MCI plan and procedure at small incidents, and this will make managing larger ones easier. If you're used to doing this stuff, then when it becomes a big emergency, it's no different for you to do it. NIMS and incident management are the national standard for incident management. Learn and practice START triage essentials. Be alert for signs of stress after incidents and seek help as necessary. This is part of the well-being of the EMT. Sometimes if you pronounce someone dead who is still alive, it can get to you. If you're leaving someone for dead that you know is still alive but they're going to die soon, it's hard to do. So be alert for the signs of stress after incidents. Remember, triage allows EMTs to prioritize care and transport patients when resources are limited. Your call is to a motor vehicle collision with an unknown number of injuries. As your unit approaches the scene, you see that 3 cars and downed wires are involved. You get a whiff of gasoline as you pass by. The drivers are visible in each vehicle. One appears to be conscious and the other 2 are bent forward or slumped back. There are passengers visible in 2 vehicles, one or more of whom may need extrication. How should you proceed? So, first and foremost, you have to remember scene safety. I know that these are patients that need immediate care, but you can't help them if you get hurt yourself. So between gasoline and downed wires, you need the fire department to stabilize that scene for you. After they are stabilized, have the fire department extricate the patients, and then you can fully triage them. The one who appears to be conscious is probably going to be lower priority than the 2 that are bent forward or slumped back. So the big thing here is, yes, even though it's a critical incident and there's a lot to do, you have to remain in scene safety mode. You cannot approach them until it's safe to do. So that brings us to the end of this chapter. Like I said at the start, a lot of this is stuff that you're not going to see that often in your career, but when you do, you have to be perfect at it. So that's why we cover this, and that's why we train on this and train and train and train, because people depend on you when it actually happens. It's a thing when seconds matter and your knowledge matters. So keep on training. Like I said during the class, if there's a countywide training that happens once a year, try to participate in them. They're actually kind of fun, especially if they get really involved with actors and everything. They can be fun to do, and it keeps you on your game. So until next time.